Hey everybody, and welcome back. This is Mr. Arvites from the coronavirus history lesson. This is AP World History. We're in part two of our imperialism section. In this section, we're going to talk about the conquest of Africa and the conquest of Asia by European powers. Now, in the last section, we talked about how imperialism was definitely fueled by industrialization. It was also fueled by large amounts of nationalism, and then, of course, social Darwinism, which gave the racial ideology for imperialism. There is a definite superiority complex. Now, Europeans are going to have to justify all of this in their minds. And so the justification is that they're bringing civilization to places that were uncivilized. However, that couldn't be any more further from the truth. What they're going to bring is brutality, death, and exploitation. And we're going to see that wholeheartedly throughout this section. In particular, we're going to talk about the British takeovers of various areas because the British are the best example. More or less everyone mirrors their version of taking it over. But we're also going to look at the Belgian Congo because the Belgian Congo is one of the largest cases of genocide that you just generally don't talk about in class. We're talking an estimated 10 million people dying at the hands of the Belgians in the Congo, all for the sake of getting rubber, essentially, from that region and exporting it back to Belgium. So here we go. Let's just get started. Now, 1862 is really kind of when our story kind of begins for imperialism in Africa, because what we had is a series of expeditions came back to Europe, and what they said were, hey, there's like 700 different groups of tribal people in Central Africa. Most Europeans had no idea about anything in Central Africa, and now all of a sudden it had been mapped out. And there's this idea that there's a lot of fractured states here. These aren't large countries in the sense that Europe has, right? These are fractured peoples. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of area, far bigger than Europe, but there aren't enough people or aren't enough states to necessarily prevent them from taking over. The other thing we have to understand is by that 1860s landmark, Europe is now poised technologically to do these things. The steam engine is now highly developed. We're talking fast transportation of boats. Railroad construction is now streamlined. That can happen as well. We're going to be talking about the completion of the Suez Canal in a little bit as well. And so all these things kind of factor into fast transportation to all of these regions. The other thing we have to understand is military technology has evolved. It's evolved immensely during this time period. Maxim machine guns, right? Repeating rifles, high-end artillery, flotillas, being able to take steamboats, go upriver, and then just shell armies is going to be how the British definitely pacify people in the Sudan. It's how they pacify people in Egypt. It's how they pacify people in South Africa. And so we're going to see that time and time again. The other thing is economically, the European powers are at the point to where they can actually do this. The thing about imperialism for Europeans is that it had to make economic sense for them to do it. They just tend to not go into places that make no economic sense. And in fact, we see this in the case of Germany. Otto von Bismarck, when Germany became a country in 1871, urges King Wilhelm to shy away from imperialism. He says, look, we don't need to do this. And in the late 1870s, when everybody was looking at Africa, Bismarck says, you look at the map of Africa and say we need to compete. My map of Africa is in Europe. To our east, we have the Russians. To our west, we have the French. That is my Africa. That's where I play, right? And so that's one of the things that we have to kind of look at with these countries is what makes sense for them. Now, Bismarck will change his tune just a couple of years later because what he realizes is that imperialism is immensely popular amongst the people. It also creates more jobs because there are new markets, and it creates just overall new wealth. And so Bismarck is going to get into imperialism to appease the electorate in Germany, and he'll also be very manipulative in how he does it. But that's Bismarck, so that makes kind of sense. But let's get back to the British. So the British are kind of our big dogs in imperialism because obviously they take over the Indian subcontinent, which is no small feat, right? This is a very impressive feat they accomplished. Now, how do they do that? Well, they take over the Indian subcontinent and large portions of Africa, the most portions of Africa of any other country, because they have the largest economic tool, okay? The British investment corps, and what the British will do, they'll set up companies, okay? Those companies could be the East India Company, right? They could be the Egypt Company, could be the Niger Company. These companies go in and they set up trade agreements with all these different rulers, right? They go to the varying tribal leaders, they get them to sign things in whatever means they can, and they set up trade agreements. They also set up little shops, they might set up a school, and they slowly start to embed themselves in the culture of that region. Now, a decade later, they start to construct some railways to connect things to the sea. And one of the things the British are always going to do is try and construct railways. When you construct railways, you employ local people because you don't want to import people to do that. That's really expensive. You employ local people to do a lot of the labor. And now you have a labor force. The British also were able to use what we would consider foreign legionary militaries, right? So they're going to enlist people in the varying regions they take over into a British-style military. The largest such force of this is going to be the Indians, right? In India, the British are going to have large amounts of Indians Indians serving in that British military. They're also going to make sure that in India, they're going to be speaking English, and they're going to be using this to fight a lot of the colonial wars that take place. So the British are going to use a lot of economic exploitation. And I think, if we kind of look at some of these stories, the one in Belgium, and I said I would talk about this, so we're going to get right into it. In Belgium, we get Henry Stanley. This is a British guy, right? He goes in and he is going to secure a series of agreements from the people of the Congo. And these are the leaders in the Congo, and they're going to agree to have Leopold II, the would-be king of Belgium, they're going to have him be the protectorate of the Congo. And so technically the Congo doesn't belong to Belgium. It belongs to Leopold II when he finally takes it over. It's technically independent from the country. And Leopold II, when he takes over the Congo in full in the late 1880s, early 1890s, is going to institute a series of policies that are extremely harsh. Now, how did they get to that point? Well, they got to that point by taking all those trade agreements and slowly building up from the 1870s to 1890. So about 15 years of buildup, and then all of a sudden it was ingrained in their society. At this point, they now have employed thousands of Congo soldiers who are then going to end up fighting against other Congo peoples, right? And so this is how the Belgians take it over. Now, what do they want from the Congo? They want rubber, in particular rubber, right? And so they're going to have these large rubber harvesting, and they're going to have people go out and they're going to do some really terrible things. And the punishments are really harsh for revolutions. They tend to massacre whole groups of people. Now, when they're harvesting the rubber, right, they have the local people doing it, and they pay the Congolese soldiers who are working for the Belgians. They're going to pay them to go out and get the rubber back. Now, they send them out with cartridges, right? They send them out with rifles and then cartridges. Those cartridges had to be returned. And so any bullet they fired, they had to have proof that they hit someone. And so this is a report from an American reporter. He said every time a corporal goes out to get rubber, cartridges are given to him. He must bring back all the used cartridges, and for every used one, he must bring back a right hand. In 6 months, they had used 6,000 cartridges, which means that 6,000 people are killed or mutilated. Actually, it means that more than 6,000 people have been killed and mutilated, because I have heard repeated stories of children and women being killed with the butts of their guns. This is just a fraction of what happens in the Congo. You're going to see large amounts of people starved out. The pictures are not easy to look at. You're going to see people chained up. We talk about Europeans eliminating slavery in the 1800s. Well, you tell that to the people of the Congo during the reign of Leopold. Eventually, this gets out, and people are outraged by this, or as much as Europeans can be outraged by this, and they demand that Leopold reforms, and he sort of does. He tries to hide a lot of the evidence going back and forth. There are some great videos you can look at that go into a lot of depth on this, but it really does kind of showcase you exactly what the Belgians were doing in the Congo, and they're all doing it for manipulation. Now, the British, when we look at it, so Egypt is an interesting case, right? The British are going to kind of be in Egypt as a protectorate, then eventually take over all of Egypt. They win a series of wars against Egyptians to do this in the 1800s. But in a lot of ways, what they really wanted was the Suez Canal, right? The Suez Canal allowed them to get trade through the Mediterranean from India. And that's the big part of Egypt they want. They also want the cotton production. They also want some of the grain production that Egypt, affords them. In Egypt, the British are going to set up schools and varying things like that. And they're going to have local Egyptian rulers rule. And that's one of the things the British tried to do. Almost everywhere the British go, they let the local rulers control things. They generally keep the same legal system in place, and the local rulers simply enforce their own laws. As time progresses, their ability to enforce things becomes less and less and less, and there is a more heavy-handed approach. In India in particular, all the leaders ended up having to speak English. If they died without an heir, the British crown received that territory, which resulted in some, questionable deaths of people very young. And so the British tended to kind of capitalize on a lot of these events. And so what they end up doing is they use mass manipulation to kind of control the peoples of these areas. They create a system in a lot of these countries, particularly in Egypt and in India, where to become part of that elite group, you had to speak English. If you wanted to get in certain areas of the city, you had to be in the military or in the foreign dignitary corps, so you had to make sure that you were involved in English education and everything else. And one of the things that the British will say is, hey, we're bringing education. We're bringing Christianity to uncivilized people. Well, that's sort of true, and in a lot of ways they do, right? And Europeans will tend to justify imperialism by saying, how many bridges were there in the Congo before the Belgians got there? How many roads were there? How many railroads were there? How many schools were there, in India? How many schools were there in Egypt? And those things are sort of true, except you have to understand that it really only benefited the really upper class. The average person was a laborer, and they were treated like nothing more than dirt. And then to make matters even worse, the British didn't really care, right? So you had these Indians who would become very Britified. They would even go to Oxford. Gandhi, gets schooled in England, but he's not respected by the British rulers in India because he's simply an Indian dressing like a British, because he couldn't possibly be as good as the British. Because remember, there's the Darwinistic, social Darwinism theories of all of that. So the broader sense of this, and my broader sense of all of this, is when Europeans went into these holdings, they set it up with a trade agreement. And over time, that trade agreement expands to a military agreement. They send in some of their own soldiers, but generally employ people in those regions to fight those battles. Okay? A lot of times in the Indian uprisings, you have Indians fighting Indians. Okay? And that's one of the things that the British are very good at doing, right? They're good at doing that. The other thing is, all of these countries are going to utilize their prisons to fuel their armies. They're going to put a lot of prisoners into the armed services to give them clemency on their crimes. And so you can pay off debts by doing that. You could also serve your time by joining in the military. And so we see a lot of people doing that. We're going to end Africa with the Boer Wars. The Boer Wars are in South Africa. And before you're thinking, oh man, this is like, when the Zulu tribe rose up. No. The Zulu tribe is before the Boer Wars, right? And that is in South Africa, and they do rise up against the British, and they do win a series of victories against the British until they bring in the full might of the British Empire, and the Zulu tribe is pacified with large-scale massacres. The Boer Wars. The Boers are former Dutch colonists, right? So these are white Dutch colonists who live in South Africa. They do not like a lot of the aspects of British control of South Africa, including the fact that the British did not allow for slavery. They said slavery is not okay. The Boers hated that. They believed in slavery. They also allow for Africans to own property. They allow for free movement. They can move out however they wanted. And so the Boers hated that. And so they gradually start to move north and north and north in South Africa. And the British were kind of cool with this because the Dutch Boers were kind of annoying and they didn't really want them there. But then they discovered diamonds in the north, and then they discovered gold in the north, and the British are going to move more and more people in, and the Boers and the British are going to go to war over this. And in the last video, I ended it off by saying people didn't care about massacres of the Heroans. The Germans massacred, 35,000 Heroan peoples in West Africa, and they more or less exterminated an entire tribe of people, and no one cared. But for the Boers who got put into concentration camps, the British would take the families of the Boers who were rebelling against the British Empire, put them in camps, and starve them to death. People got really offended by that because it was white Christians dying. And so we see that racial component kind of come out more and more and more. The Boer Wars end up ending with the Boers still maintaining a sense of autonomy. And what's crazy about that, you talk about ripple effects that go through time. The Boers are going to take that racial ideology that they had, where Africans were not equal to whites, and they're going to form the apartheid, right? And the apartheid policies in South Africa that will remain in place until they're eliminated with the election of Nelson Mandela, right? Who some of you seem to always say is Morgan Freeman because of the movie Invictus. But Nelson Mandela comes into play in South Africa and eliminates that apartheid mentality. But the apartheid is South Africans. It's the descendants of the Boers and the British in South Africa, these white South Africans who don't allow for any voting, and they completely ostracize Africans from the process, even though they represent 95% of the population. Clearly, that could be a problem going forward, and it will be. And it's one of the most just horrible regimes in the 20th century. And so that's a result of the British policy of allowing the Boers to kind of remain somewhat autonomous while in the nets of the British Empire. Honestly, the British just didn't care what they did as long as the economics were still just ciphering off to Britain. As long as it was a monopolized trade going to Britain, they did not care. Okay? And that brings us to the next little section that we kind of get into, and that is competition. Okay? Competition between these empires is immense. And so what we see are, like, let's say the Germans. Otto von Bismarck is a perfect example of this. He plays the British and the French off each other. And in fact, a lot of people think his main goal of imperialism was to separate the British-French alliance. And that's what he does. In the 1880s, he plays them off each other, basically telling the British, hey, I'll back you up with the Suez Canal as long as you give us part of Southeast Africa. And the British will do that. And then they also ask them to back up their claims, in part of West Africa against the French claims. And the British will do that so long as they recognize Egypt. And so Bismarck is a genius at playing these countries off each other. He does this rather remarkably well. And the other thing that he does is in 1884, he holds the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference is when all the European powers get together in Berlin and they divide up Africa and they recognize who owns what. And it's all organized by Bismarck, and it's here where Bismarck essentially believes that as he looks at these powers, he thinks, hey, a war is going to start, but he doesn't think it's going to start in Africa. And we see a couple of years later, he predicts the war won't start in Africa or in Asia, it'll start in the Balkans. And boy, was he right, because 1914, that's when World War I started. But as we move forward, right, and we go over to Asia, we have to kind of look at a couple things in Asia. I've talked about India a good amount, but I think it's important to understand that the British conquest of India starts in the late 1700s, and then it just fuels on and on and on. And it starts off with trade agreements with the local princes, and they manipulate that. They build large-scale railways. And so if you look at a map of India and you see lots and lots of railways constructed, that's when the British are taking over. Central India was looked at as impossible to take over, but the British bought railways there. That allowed Central Indian kings to export their materials. And so they made alliances with the British. Those alliances would result in a complete takeover of India. India is a country at this point in time of like 300 million people or 200 million people, and it's going to be controlled by 6,000 British politicians. That's it. 6,000. Now, they'll have right around 250,000 soldiers that are going to be located in India. And they'll have an additional like 200,000 Indian soldiers that are going to be employed. And the Indians do revolt a number of times, and the British put it down rather harshly, where you have arresting of families of people who are revolting, and they shoot people, firing squad style. And so there are massacres that take place. And the British kind of do that. The other thing the British do is they bring education to the major cities. Now, that when we say bring education, they're not bringing education to the poor people in India. The poor people in India and the caste system and everything else that went in there, the British allowed that to maintain its place. They did educate the upper class of India, and they allowed people who could pay for it to send their kids to English schools and learn English, and they could be a better part of the society. They allowed Indians to kind of run themselves, but at the same token, they had to answer to British overseers. And so that's kind of how they took over India. Now, one thing I think is kind of interesting to kind of talk about is they use a lot of Indian soldiers in various wars. And we're going to see that all throughout the next kind of phase in history, including in World War I, where we see large amounts of Indian soldiers fighting for the British Empire. Now, the last part of this, and we're running a little late, but that's okay. The last part of this is Japan and China. These are two countries who in Asia have been kind of the big time players that we talk about, the most fascinating ones in the history of that part of Asia, Southeast Asia, and they're going to go on two totally different paths. Okay, both of them are at a crossroads in the mid-1800s. They both could industrialize, they both could advance, and Japan does and China doesn't. And understanding China's culture and their history is immensely important in understanding this, right? So if you were looking at a short answer question asking about this, the answer when you talk about with China, why don't they industrialize? Well, they tried to. They had some industrialization that took place. Some railroads are being constructed. But if you recall, China's culture is immensely powerful, right? That scholar gentry class, they believe in tradition, they believe in cultural tradition, everything else, and they said that this industrialization was killing their cultural traditions. It was ruining the earth. It was ruining their relationship with nature because you were carving it up with these artificial railroads. And so China rejects industrialization, and they reject a lot of the Western technologies and ideas throughout the late 1800s. This is going to really be bad going forward for China. Japan, on the other hand, who had been abused by European powers in the mid-1800s, has the Meiji Restoration, and then all of a sudden kicks everybody out, and then says, we're going to industrialize, and we're going to catch up in all of this. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, we see Japan bring in advisors from various countries all around the world and begin to industrialize. They bring in investors from various places, including Britain and Germany, including France, okay? And they're going to revamp everything they do. They'll revamp their military, they'll revamp their style of clothing. We see westernized clothing. We see the banning of samurai garb, right? We see the banning of the samurai in general. And there is a really not so great movie called The Last Samurai, where Tom Cruise, of course, learns how to be a samurai in 2 days, because that's a thing. But that's okay. It's worth a watch. It's on Netflix. But the Japanese start to industrialize majorly, and so it all hits a tipping point. In 1894. In 1894, right, we see the Japanese and we see the Chinese go into war with each other, the Sino-Japanese War. And Japan becomes the first Asian country to really just mop the floor with the Chinese in a long time, since the Mongolians. And the reason they did so is Japan has a completely imperialized army, centralized state, centralized army. China is regionally controlled under the Qing Empire, okay? They have a lot of fractionalized states. They can't marshal everybody to form their military. They do not have a professional military by any sense of the imagination. And China's able to beat them, or Japan's able to beat China in this regard. And so what does Japan get out of this? Well, Korea becomes independent, quote unquote. We say independent. Japan agrees to protect Korea, and then in 1910, they annex it. They also get part of Manchuria, which, as we know, when we get to World War II, they'll take over the rest of Manchuria in 1933 and 34. So, Japan is going to get large-scale territories in that. It also puts them on that global map. Now, when China loses these wars to Japan, keep in mind, that's off the heels of losing wars to Britain and France over the opium trade. So now the Chinese government is looking very, very weak. You factor in a couple of famines in that, and they're looking really bad to their people. That mandate of heaven, right? You're appointed by the gods, doesn't look very good when everything's a disaster around you. So the other thing that happens is after Japan beats China, we see an open season on China. The United States calls it the open door policy, right? Where everybody can just go on in. And the British had already started to do this, so did the French. But now every European power is going to go into the varying ports of China and set up their own trading hubs. And we see more European goods flooding into China, causing massive unemployment. China used to be the largest manufacturer on earth, and they are getting just destroyed now by European goods. Okay? And remember, this is a country that used to not import anything. And now they're importing everything. And so China becomes dependent on foreign goods. We see all these different things. We see corruption at the local and the national levels. And then finally, this group called the Boxers in 1900 come up and they rebel. And they start massacring Europeans and Americans and Christian missionaries. And they're going to get massacred themselves by a joint army of pretty much everyone that fought against each other in World War I, teams up to fight the Boxers. Well, China ends up going down a downward path here, and by 1915, we see kind of the dissolving of the empires. We see a civil war take place in China that won't really be resolved until after World War II. And if you're wondering what the conquest of Africa did, the conquest of Africa, and look at the Congo as a great example. When the Congo became independent in the early 1950s, late 1940s, it only had 12 college graduates because that education that Europeans said they were bringing, they didn't really bring to the Congo. We see whole regions that are brought together. Those 700 different tribes and 700 different ethnicities are put into one country. It causes mass civil war. And the infrastructures that are exploited by Europeans are left desolate. Their economies are left destroyed. And the countries struggle, and they struggle, and they struggle. And so that's why you see the struggles of Africa in the second half of the 20th century, because these countries were left with a lack of resources. They were left with a lack of political capital. They were left with a lack of education because European powers simply just didn't care. Now, in India, we see slightly different because India maintained more autonomy than most of these other places and had gradually received independence as opposed to the post-World War II, let's just dump it all out because we're broke mentality that the Europeans had. But India is in a slightly better position, though we know the British break up the Indian subcontinent, right? Where we have Muslims in Pakistan and we have the Hindus in India. And so they break up part of that part as well. So that's kind of our little in-depth takeover of imperialism. I hope you got a little bit out of it. Next time, we're going to kind of walk through the essay that in my class you're going to be writing and that you could be writing on the AP exam, a good old cause and effect essay. So until next time, take it easy, guys, and good luck.